Hello everyone. Today, Biker Justice Analyst bring you a story full of humanity and compassion. Enjoy listening.
Rich CEO kicks a biker, not knowing he's the infamous Hell's Angel. Brian Taylor's polished Italian leather shoes clicked against the cobblestones as he strolled through the peaceful lakeside town. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the quaint storefronts, their weathered signs and flower boxes a stark contrast to the sleek office buildings he usually frequented. He adjusted his custom-tailored suit jacket, a hint of satisfaction crossing his face as he felt the smooth fabric. The quiet here was different from his usual environment of buzzing phones and urgent meetings, but his mind still raced with business calculations. "If we secure the Morgan account," he muttered to himself, "that's another $30 million in revenue this quarter." His fingers tapped against his expensive briefcase, its leather matching his shoes perfectly. Everything about Brian spoke of careful curation, from his perfectly trimmed salt and pepper hair to his manicured nails. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. The lake sparkled in the distance, but Brian barely noticed its beauty. His thoughts drifted to the upcoming board meeting. "We'll need to restructure the Eastern Division," he mused, his brow furrowing. "Perhaps lay off about 20%. As he approached a wooden bench facing the lake, his steps slowed. A large man occupied one end of the bench, his presence impossible to ignore. Brian's nose wrinkled slightly as he took in the stranger's appearance. The man wore a worn leather jacket covered in patches, his massive arms decorated with faded tattoos that disappeared beneath his sleeves. His gray-streaked beard was unkempt, and his boots were scuffed and dirty. A leather bag sat beside him on the bench, taking up more space than necessary. Despite his rough appearance, the man, Hank Calloway, though Brian didn't know his name, sat with an air of complete ease. His legs were crossed casually at the ankles, and his weathered hands rested loosely in his lap. He seemed to be enjoying the lake view, his face peaceful beneath its harsh exterior. Brian hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward. This was a public bench, after all, and he wasn't about to let some biker make him feel uncomfortable. He could spare a few minutes to rest his feet before heading back to his hotel. As he moved to sit, his briefcase bumped against Hank's leather bag. The bag tipped over, spilling its contents onto the wooden slats of the bench and the ground below. A few papers fluttered in the breeze, and what looked like a worn notebook landed with a soft thud. Brian's lip curled in disgust. Rather than help gather the fallen items, he straightened his spine and looked down at Hank with disdain. His voice dripped with condescension as he muttered, "Watch where you're sitting, old man." The words hung in the air for a moment, sharp and ugly against the peaceful backdrop of the lake. Slowly, deliberately, Hank uncrossed his ankles and rose to his full height. He seemed to keep rising until he towered over Brian, his broad shoulders blocking out the afternoon sun. Brian's confidence wavered as he found himself staring up into Hank's face. The biker's expression was completely unreadable, his eyes steady and calm as they met Brian's. In that moment, the expensive suit and air of superiority felt paper-thin against Hank's solid presence. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lakeside path as Hank's imposing figure loomed over Brian. Despite the sudden shift in power dynamics, Brian's practiced corporate mask didn't slip. Years of boardroom battles had taught him never to show weakness, even when caught off guard. "Is there a problem here?" Brian's voice carried the sharp edge he usually reserved for subordinates who dared to question his decisions. He straightened his silk tie, a nervous habit masked as a power move. A small group of tourists paused their walk, sensing the tension in the air. The lake breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the distant sound of boat horns and seagulls, but the space between the two men remained charged with silence. Hank didn't move. His weathered face remained calm, almost serene, as he stood like an immovable mountain. His leather jacket creaked slightly as he crossed his arms, the patches and worn edges telling stories Brian couldn't read. "You're blocking the sidewalk," Brian said, his voice rising with irritation. He gestured sharply with his briefcase. "Some of us have places to be. Move along." The words came out clipped and dismissive, each syllable dripping with the entitlement of someone used to having their commands obeyed instantly. Still, Hank didn't budge. His eyes, clear and steady, studied Brian with the patience of a man who had seen far worse than an angry businessman in an expensive suit. The scattered contents of his leather bag lay forgotten on the ground between them. A couple walking their dog crossed to the other side of the path, throwing concerned glances their way. The crowd growing around them maintained a cautious distance, like spectators at a circus watching a lion tamer at work. Brian's face flushed red. His carefully maintained composure began to crack under Hank's unwavering gaze. "Listen here," he snapped, taking a step forward. "I don't know what your problem is, but I've had enough of this little standoff." Sweat began to bead on Brian's forehead, despite the cool lake breeze. His grip tightened on his briefcase until his knuckles turned white. The silence from the large man before him was more unnerving than any shouted threat could have been. "Move," Brian demanded one final time. When Hank remained still, Brian's patience snapped. He thrust his shoulder forward, attempting to shoulder past the larger man, his free hand rising to push Hank aside. In one fluid motion, Hank's hand shot out and caught Brian's arm. His grip was like iron wrapped in leather, firm enough to stop Brian's movement, completely but carefully measured to avoid causing pain. The gentle restraint somehow made it even more intimidating. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Brian saw something shift in Hank's expression. Not anger, but something closer to pity mixed with amusement. The larger man's voice, when it finally came, was surprisingly soft and controlled, carrying a gravelly weight that made Brian's spine tingle. "You really don't know who you're messing with, do you?" Hank asked, his words cutting through the tension like a knife through butter. The crowd around them had grown larger now, their whispers creating a nervous buzz in the air. Several people had their phones out, recording the confrontation. An elderly woman gasped, her hand covering her mouth as she recognized the man in the leather jacket. The whispers rippled through the growing crowd like waves on the lake. Brian caught fragments of hushed conversations that made his stomach drop. "That's Hank Calloway, the Hells Angels leader. Can't believe that suit just tried to push him around." An elderly woman in a floral dress clutched her shopping bag tighter, leaning toward her companion. "That's the one they call the Angel of Second Chances. Never thought I'd see someone foolish enough to challenge him like this." The color drained from Brian's face as the reality of the situation sank in. His mind raced through newspaper headlines and charity gala photos he'd seen. The notorious biker leader who'd transformed his life to help others. The man whose influence stretched far beyond the leather-clad brotherhood he led. Brian's throat went dry. The expensive watch on his wrist suddenly felt heavy, his designer suit too tight. The carefully constructed facade of corporate superiority crumbled under Hank's steady gaze. I didn't," Brian stammered, his usual eloquence deserting him. Sweat trickled down his back, and his briefcase felt slippery in his grip. A young man in the crowd pulled out his phone, the camera lens catching the sunlight. "This is going viral for sure," he muttered to his friend. Brian's cheeks burned with shame. He could already imagine the social media headlines. CEO tries to bully charitable biker leader. His board members would have a field day with this one. Hank remained silent, his presence commanding respect without a single word. His tattooed hand still held Brian's arm firmly but gently, a reminder of the power he chose not to use. More onlookers gathered, their whispers growing louder. Someone mentioned Hank's Veterans Program, another spoke of his work with troubled youth. Each comment was another blow to Brian's ego, each revelation making his earlier behavior seem more and more childish. "Mr. Calloway," Brian managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper, "I apologize for my behavior. I was out of line." The words felt foreign in his mouth. When was the last time he'd offered a genuine apology to anyone? The crowd fell silent, waiting for Hank's response. The only sound was the gentle lapping of lake waves against the shore, and the distant cry of seagulls. Hank's expression softened slightly, the corner of his mouth twitching into what might have been a smirk. Without a word, he released his grip on Brian's arm, the movement smooth and deliberate. He bent down, collected his scattered belongings with unhurried dignity, and straightened up. Their eyes met one final time. In that moment, Brian saw something in Hank's gaze that shook him more than any confrontation could have. Understanding, maybe even compassion. Then Hank turned and walked away, his leather jacket catching the late afternoon sun. The crowd parted automatically, creating a path for him. He moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. Brian stood rooted to the spot, his expensive shoes suddenly feeling too tight. His hand unconsciously rubbed the spot where Hank had gripped his arm. He watched the larger man's retreating figure until it disappeared into the dispersing crowd, the weight of his own arrogance settling heavy on his shoulders. Brian's footsteps echoed through his empty penthouse apartment as he made his way to the kitchen. The sun had set over the lake, casting long shadows across his minimalist furnishings. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for a crystal tumbler, the events of the afternoon still fresh in his mind. The amber liquid splashed against the glass as he poured himself 2 fingers of scotch. It was the expensive kind, the type he'd always used to impress clients and celebrate business deals. Tonight, though, it tasted bitter on his tongue. His phone buzzed again, the 5th time in the past hour. Messages from the office about quarterly projections and upcoming meetings filled the screen. Brian swiped them away with an irritated gesture. For the first time in years, work seemed trivial compared to the weight pressing against his chest. He loosened his tie and sank into his leather armchair, the one that faced the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the town. From up here, everything looked small, manageable, but he couldn't shake the image of Hank Calloway's steady gaze, couldn't forget the quiet strength in the man's demeanor. "What kind of person have I become?" Brian muttered to himself, swirling the scotch in his glass. His reflection in the window showed a successful man by all outward appearances: tailored suit, perfectly styled hair, confident posture. Yet today, that image had crumbled in seconds. The whispers from the crowd echoed in his mind. They'd spoken of Hank's work with veterans, his dedication to helping others. Meanwhile, what had Brian done with his success besides accumulate more wealth? He took another sip, letting the liquid burn down his throat. His laptop chimed from his desk. Probably another work email, he thought. But as he glanced at the screen, the subject line caught his attention. Annual Veterans Support Gala. Special invitation. Brian set down his glass and moved to his desk, clicking open the email. The invitation was elegant but understated, describing an upcoming charity event to support local veterans programs. His eyes fixed on one particular detail: lead contributor, Hank Calloway. The cursor hovered over the delete button. It would be easier to forget this whole day had happened, to go back to his normal routine of meetings and deal-making. Yet something held him back. He thought of Hank again, not as the intimidating figure from the afternoon, but as someone who had chosen to use his influence for good. The contrast with his own life choices felt stark and uncomfortable. His phone buzzed once more with another work message, but Brian ignored it. Instead, he found himself reading through the invitation details again. The event was scheduled for next week at the Lakeside Community Center, a far cry from the usual black-tie galas he attended. Brian's finger moved to the accept button. His heart raced slightly, like he was about to close a major business deal. But this felt different. This wasn't about profit margins or corporate advancement. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt a pull toward something more meaningful. With a deep breath, he clicked accept. The confirmation message appeared on screen, and Brian felt an unexpected sense of relief wash over him. It was a small step, perhaps, but something in his gut told him it was the right one. He glanced at his reflection again in the darkened window. The successful CEO was still there, but now there was something else too. A hint of uncertainty, yes, but also the faintest glimmer of possibility. Brian adjusted his Italian silk tie as he stepped into the Veterans Center. The building was modest compared to his usual corporate venues, but there was a warmth here that no luxury hotel could match. Simple decorations adorned the walls, photographs of veterans, American flags, and handmade thank you cards from local children. The reception area buzzed with conversation. Men and women in evening wear mingled with others in more casual attire, creating an unusual mix of social circles. Brian noticed how his perfectly tailored suit and polished shoes made him stand out, but not in the way he was used to. A server offered him a glass of wine, and he accepted it mechanically, his eyes scanning the room. That's when he saw Hank. The big man stood near the back wall, surrounded by a small group of veterans. He wore a clean black shirt and dress pants, a far cry from his leather jacket, but his tattoos were still visible on his forearms. Brian hung back, watching the interaction from a distance. Hank's presence was different here. The intimidating figure from yesterday had transformed into something else entirely. He listened intently as an elderly veteran spoke, nodding with understanding. His large hand rested gently on the shoulder of another veteran who looked to be fighting back tears. "That's Jack Sanders," a woman next to Brian whispered, noticing his gaze. "The one crying. He served in Vietnam. Hank saved his life, not in the war, but here at home. Found him living under a bridge last winter." Brian's throat tightened. He watched as Hank leaned in closer to Jack, speaking words too soft to hear. Whatever he said made Jack straighten his shoulders, a small smile breaking through his tears. The scene before him was so far removed from Brian's world of boardrooms and business deals. There were no hidden agendas here, no corporate maneuvering, just raw humanity and genuine care. Another veteran joined the group, and Hank's face lit up with recognition. They embraced like brothers, the veteran's cane clattering to the floor. Without missing a beat, Hank bent down to retrieve it, handling the man's dignity as carefully as the cane itself. Brian took a sip of his wine, but barely tasted it. His mind flashed back to yesterday's confrontation, how quick he'd been to judge, how easily he'd dismissed Hank based on appearances alone. Now, watching Hank console and support these veterans, Brian felt shame creep up his neck. The tough exterior that had seemed so threatening yesterday now looked like armor, not to protect Hank from others, but to protect his soft heart as he carried the emotional burdens of those he helped. A burst of laughter drew Brian's attention back to the group. Hank was grinning, his whole face transformed by joy as he shared some joke with the veterans. The men around him seemed to stand taller in his presence, as if Hank's strength somehow flowed into them. Something stirred in Brian's chest, an unfamiliar ache. He realized he was witnessing something he'd never found in all his years of corporate success. Purpose. Real, meaningful purpose. These weren't just charitable acts for tax write-offs or PR opportunities. This was authentic human connection, the kind that changed lives. He watched as Hank pulled a young veteran into a conversation, his eyes filled with genuine kindness and understanding. The contrast between this Hank and yesterday's intimidating figure made Brian's heart constrict with longing. For the first time in his life, all his achievements felt hollow compared to the simple act of helping another human being. Brian watched as the last veteran patted Hank on the shoulder and walked away. His heart pounded against his chest as he took measured steps toward the imposing figure. The confidence he usually carried in business meetings seemed to evaporate with each step. Hank stood alone now, his massive frame leaning against a weathered support beam. The overhead lights caught the gray in his beard, and up close, Brian could see the deeper meaning behind each tattoo that decorated his arms. Military insignias, memorial dates, and words of honor. The distance between them felt like miles, though it was only a few feet. Brian's Italian leather shoes clicked softly against the worn wooden floor. A few nearby conversations quieted as people noticed his approach, probably remembering yesterday's confrontation. His throat felt dry. The wine glass in his hand suddenly seemed ridiculous, a symbol of the privileged world he came from. He set it down on a nearby table, wiping his palm against his expensive suit pants. Hank's eyes met his, the same steady gaze from yesterday, but without the tension. Instead, there was something else there. Understanding? Amusement? Brian couldn't quite tell. "Mr. Calloway," Brian said, his voice carrying none of its usual authority. He extended his hand, feeling more vulnerable than he had in years. The memory of his behavior yesterday played fresh in his mind, his dismissive attitude, his harsh words. "I want to apologize for yesterday. The way I acted was—" He paused, searching for the right words. It was inexcusable. Hank's expression remained neutral, but his eyes softened slightly. Brian felt compelled to continue. "I didn't know who you were," he admitted, his voice softer than usual. The words felt inadequate as soon as they left his mouth. He realized they made him sound even worse, as if Hank's identity as a Hells Angels leader was the only reason he deserved respect. A few veterans nearby watched the exchange with interest. Brian could feel their eyes on him, judging whether his apology was sincere. The air felt thick with anticipation. Hank studied him for a moment longer, his weathered face unreadable. Then, slowly, a hint of a smile appeared beneath his beard. He reached out and took Brian's offered hand in his much larger one. His grip was firm, but not threatening, calloused palms meeting manicured ones. "It's all right," Hank said, his voice carrying the same quiet strength from yesterday, but now with a gentler edge. "We've all been where you are." Before Brian could respond, Hank released his hand and turned away, moving through the crowd with surprising grace for such a large man. He left Brian standing there, those 5 simple words echoing in his mind. "We've all been where you are." Brian watched Hank's retreating back, the words settling into his chest like stones dropping into still water. The ripples of their meaning spread through him, touching something deep and uncomfortable, something he'd been avoiding for a long time. Brian sat in his corner office, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city skyline. The morning sun glinted off neighboring glass buildings, casting patterns across his polished mahogany desk. His fingers drummed absently on the surface as he reviewed quarterly reports. The sharp ring of his phone cut through his concentration. The caller ID showed a local number he didn't recognize. Usually his assistant screened his calls, but she was out sick today. "Brian Taylor speaking," he answered, his voice crisp and professional. "Mr. Taylor?" The voice on the other end was hesitant, but determined. "This is Sarah Martinez from the Veterans Hope Center. We got your contact information from Mr. Calloway." Brian's fingers stopped drumming. The memory of Hank's quiet strength at the charity event flashed through his mind. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," Sarah continued, "but we're facing a serious situation here. Our main funding source just pulled out, and we're looking at having to close our doors within 2 months. Brian leaned back in his leather chair, his attention fully captured now. "Go on," he said, softer than his usual business tone. "We serve over 200 veterans in this area." Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "Many of them depend on our services for basic necessities, food, shelter, counseling. Mr. Calloway has been incredibly generous over the years, but even he can't cover this shortfall alone." Through the phone, Brian could hear the background noise of the center. Muffled conversations, a door closing, someone laughing. It sounded warm, alive, human. "The amount we need—" Sarah paused, as if bracing herself. "It's substantial. We're looking at a deficit of $500,000 annually." Brian's mind automatically started calculating. $500,000 was a drop in the bucket for his company's charitable foundation. One signature, and the problem could be solved. But something made him hesitate. He thought about Jack, the veteran Sanders, whom he'd met briefly at the charity event. The way the old soldier's hands had shaken as he described how the center had saved his life. The quiet dignity in his voice when he spoke about helping other veterans find their way back from the edge. "Mr. Taylor?" Sarah's voice brought him back to the present. "I know it's a lot to ask, but Mr. Calloway mentioned you might be able to help. He said you seem to understand the importance of what we do here." Brian stood up and walked to the window. Below, the city bustled with morning traffic. People rushing to and fro, focused on their own concerns. Just like he had been that day he'd encountered Hank. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. Expensive suit, perfectly trimmed hair, the very picture of corporate success. But now he saw something else, too. Something that needed to change. "The corporate world has connections," Sarah added, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. "Maybe you could help us find other donors, or—" Brian remained silent, his mind racing through possibilities. His company's foundation could help, yes. But he also sat on boards, knew other CEOs, had connections that could make a real difference. The kind of difference that went beyond just writing a check. As the call ended, Brian stood motionless at the window, still holding the phone. The Veterans Center's predicament weighed heavily on his mind. This wasn't like other business decisions he'd faced. This was about people. Real people with real struggles. People like Jack, who'd found hope through the center's work. Something stirred in his chest, an unfamiliar feeling of responsibility that went deeper than business obligations. For the first time in his career, he felt truly challenged to do more than just succeed. He felt challenged to make a difference. The fluorescent lights of the Veterans Hope Center's meeting room cast a harsh glow over the worn, folding tables arranged in a rectangle. Brian adjusted his tie, feeling oddly out of place in his tailored suit among the casual attire of the board members. The walls, decorated with military flags and photos of smiling veterans, told stories of lives rebuilt and hope restored. Sarah Martinez, who had called him earlier, stood at the head of the table. Her rolled-up sleeves and messy ponytail spoke of someone who worked in the trenches, not behind a desk. "Everyone, this is Brian Taylor. He's here to help us with our funding crisis." 10 pairs of eyes turned to study him. Brian recognized Jack Sanders among them, the veteran's weathered face showing cautious optimism. Next to Jack sat a younger woman in military fatigues, her prosthetic leg visible beneath the table. "Thank you for having me," Brian began, his voice softer than his usual boardroom tone. "I've reviewed your financial statements, and I believe I can help." He pulled out his tablet and brought up a spreadsheet. "Your current operating costs are sustainable with the right funding structure. What you need is a diversified donor base and corporate partnerships." "We've tried corporate partnerships before," a gray-haired man interrupted, his voice tight with frustration. "They always want to change who we are, make us fit their image." Brian nodded, understanding their skepticism. "I'm not here to change anything. I'm here to help you keep doing what you're already doing well." He walked them through his preliminary plan, a combination of corporate donations, private fundraising events, and grant applications. His words were met with murmurs of approval, but he could sense their underlying concern. "Look," Brian said, setting aside his tablet. "I know I'm the new face here. I represent exactly what many of you are wary of. Corporate America swooping in to fix things. But I've seen the work you do. I've talked to the veterans you help." Jack Sanders cleared his throat. "You've got the knowledge we need, Mr. Taylor. But why should we trust you?" The room fell silent. Brian looked at the faces around him, people who had dedicated their lives to helping others. He thought of his first encounter with Hank, how quickly he'd judged based on appearances. "You shouldn't trust me yet," Brian admitted. "That's why I want to work with Hank Calloway on this. Nothing happens without his approval. He knows this community, knows what works and what doesn't. I'm just here to provide the business expertise." Sarah's expression softened. "Hank mentioned you might say that. He said you were learning." The tension in the room eased slightly. The younger woman with the prosthetic leg leaned forward. "What's your timeline?" Brian spent the next hour outlining specific steps, answering questions and taking notes. These people knew their needs better than he ever could. His job wasn't to lead, it was to listen and support. As the meeting wrapped up, Brian gathered his materials, exchanging handshakes with the board members. Jack Sanders stopped him at the door. "You surprised us today, Mr. Taylor, in a good way." Brian stepped out into the afternoon sun, his mind already working through his list of contacts. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders, different from the pressure of corporate deadlines. This mattered more. He pulled out his phone, looking at Hank's number in his contacts. Would the former Hells Angels leader agree to work with him? Brian tucked the phone away, knowing this next conversation would be crucial. After the board meeting, Brian lingered in the Veterans Center's common area. The late afternoon sun streamed through dusty windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. The familiar scent of coffee wafted from a small kitchenette where a pot stayed perpetually brewing. Jack Sanders approached him, 2 steaming mugs in hand. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering one to Brian. His hands trembled slightly as he held the cup, a detail Brian couldn't help but notice. "Thanks," Brian said, accepting the coffee. He noticed Jack's military tattoo peeking out from under his sleeve, the mark of the 101st Airborne Division. They sat in mismatched chairs near a window. Outside, an American flag fluttered in the breeze. Jack's eyes seemed fixed on it, lost in thought. "You know," Jack began, his voice rough but gentle, "I used to be somebody important too. Lieutenant, Special Operations. Had my whole life planned out." He paused, taking a sip of coffee. "Then Vietnam happened." Brian remained silent, sensing Jack had more to say. "Coming back was harder than being there," Jack continued. "The nightmares, the flashbacks, they don't show those in the movies. Couldn't hold down a job, couldn't maintain relationships, started drinking to quiet the demons. His fingers drummed against the coffee mug. Lost everything. Brian shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His own problems, corporate takeovers, profit margins, shareholder meetings, suddenly seemed trivial. Found myself living under a bridge, Jack said. That's where Hank found me. He didn't just throw money at the problem. He sat with me, listened, got me into this program. Jack's eyes met Brian's. You see, money alone doesn't fix broken spirits. It's the human connection that saves lives. The weight of Jack's words settled heavily on Brian's shoulders. He thought about his own life, filled with expensive suits and luxury cars, but somehow lacking in real meaning. How did you... Brian hesitated. How did you find purpose again? Jack smiled, slightly. Started small, helped other vets fill out paperwork, listened to their stories, realized my experiences, even the painful ones, could help others. He leaned forward. You know what the real difference between success and significance is? Brian shook his head. Success is what you achieve for yourself. Significance is what you do for others. Jack stood up slowly, his joints creaking. It's not the money, Mr. Taylor. It's what you do with it. Brian remained seated, letting Jack's words sink in. Through the window he watched veterans coming and going, some young, some old, all carrying invisible wounds. Each one had a story like Jack's, he realized. Each one mattered. Rising from his chair, Brian extended his hand to Jack. Thank you for sharing your story with me. Jack's grip was firm, despite his trembling hands. Just remember what I said. These folks don't need another businessman. They need someone who understands what matters. Walking toward the exit, Brian felt different. The familiar weight of his expensive watch on his wrist seemed less important now. Jack's words echoed in his mind. It's not the money. It's what you do with it. For the first time in years, Brian questioned whether his definition of success had been wrong all along. Brian adjusted his tie as he strode into the glass-walled conference room of Taylor Technologies. The familiar smell of leather chairs and coffee couldn't mask the tension in the air. Around the polished mahogany table sat the board members, faces he'd known for years, but somehow seemed different now. The numbers don't lie, Brian, said Richard Morton, the CFO, tapping his tablet screen. His wire-rimmed glasses reflected spreadsheet data. We're talking about a significant allocation of resources here. Brian remained standing, his hands resting on the back of his chair. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city skyline stretched out behind him. The Veterans Center helps hundreds of people every month, he said. They're facing closure without proper funding. Margaret Chen, head of operations, cleared her throat. While we appreciate your personal interest in this cause, our shareholders expect returns, not charity cases. The word charity cases made Brian's jaw tighten. He thought of Jack, of his trembling hands and unwavering dignity, of the stories he'd heard in the past weeks. Soldiers who'd given everything for their country, only to come home to nothing. These aren't charity cases, Brian said, his voice firm. These are men and women who sacrificed everything for us, and now they need our help. Be reasonable, Richard interjected. We're running a business, not a nonprofit. Brian pulled out his own tablet, bringing up images of the Veterans Center. Look at what they do there. Rehabilitation programs, job training, mental health support. They're not just asking for handouts, they're rebuilding lives. Noble goals, Margaret said, her tone dismissive. But our quarterly projections... Our projections? Brian interrupted, feeling heat rise in his collar. Do you know what Jack Sanders's projections were when he served in Vietnam? Or what any of these veterans projected when they put their lives on the line? The room fell silent. Brian could hear his heart pounding in his ears. "This isn't about numbers anymore," he continued, softer now. "It's about doing what's right. We have the resources to make a real difference." "You're letting emotions cloud your judgment," Richard said. "This isn't the Brian Taylor we know." Brian looked around the table, at the faces of people he'd worked with for years. People who shared his old values of profit above all else. Maybe that Brian Taylor needed to change. "Are you willing to stake your reputation on this?" Margaret asked, her eyes narrowing. Brian straightened his spine, feeling stronger in his conviction than he had about anything in years. "Yes, because some things matter more than reputation or profit margins." He pulled up more figures on the screen. "And if you look at these numbers, you'll see how we can make this work without compromising our business goals." The board members exchanged glances. This wasn't the proposal they'd expected, nor was this the Brian Taylor they were used to dealing with. The silence stretched out, heavy with the weight of the decision before them. Brian remained standing, his heart racing but his resolve firm. In his mind, he saw Jack's face, heard the stories of countless veterans who'd found hope at the center. He thought of Hank's quiet dedication to the cause. This wasn't just about funding anymore. It was about standing up for what he believed in, even if it meant risking everything he'd built. The boardroom fell into tense silence as everyone waited for the next move. Brian's career, his reputation, and the fate of the Veterans Center hung in the balance. Brian sat alone in his corner office, the city lights twinkling through the floor-to-ceiling windows like distant stars. His suit jacket hung over the back of his chair, his tie loosened around his neck. Stacks of financial reports and funding proposals cluttered his normally pristine desk. The numbers blurred before his tired eyes. He rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of it all. The Veterans Center needed substantial funding, more than he'd initially thought. Even with his personal contribution and the limited support he'd managed to secure from the board, they were still falling short. He picked up his coffee mug, only to find it empty for the third time that evening. The clock on his wall showed 9:45 p.m., but time had lost its meaning hours ago. His phone buzzed with another message from Margaret. "Reconsider your position. The shareholders won't understand." Brian stood up and walked to the window, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. Below, the city moved in its usual rhythm, oblivious to his internal struggle. He thought about Jack and the other veterans he'd met. Their faces, their stories, their quiet dignity in the face of overwhelming challenges. It all felt so far removed from this towering office building. "What am I doing?" he muttered to himself. For the first time in his career, the path forward wasn't clear. His whole life had been built on calculated decisions, risk assessments, and profit margins. But now, something else pulled at him. Something that couldn't be quantified in spreadsheets or quarterly reports. He returned to his desk and pulled up his personal investment portfolio. The numbers were impressive, the result of decades of smart business moves. But as he stared at the screen, the figures seemed hollow, meaningless compared to the work being done at the Veterans Center. The sound of heavy boots in the hallway broke his concentration. Brian looked up, surprised. The cleaning crew wasn't due for another hour. The door opened without a knock, and Hank's large frame filled the doorway. He wore his usual leather jacket, looking completely out of place among the modern office decor. "Security let you up?" Brian asked, somehow not entirely surprised by the unexpected visit. Hank shrugged, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I can be persuasive when I need to be." He walked over to Brian's desk, taking in the scattered papers and empty coffee cups. Without waiting for an invitation, he lowered himself into one of the leather chairs facing Brian. His presence seemed to fill the room, making the spacious office feel smaller. Brian waited for him to speak, to explain his presence, but Hank simply sat there, studying him with those penetrating eyes. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. Finally, Brian spoke. "I'm trying to make this work, but..." He gestured at the papers strewn across his desk. "The numbers just aren't adding up." Hank nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this. He leaned forward slightly in his chair, his eyes never leaving Brian's face. "The hardest part is deciding where you stand," he said quietly. "The rest will fall into place." Morning light streamed through Brian's office windows as he pored over the financial records. His conversation with Hank the previous night had kept him restless, leading him to arrive at work hours before anyone else. Something about the numbers hadn't sat right with him, and now he knew why. The more he dug, the more his stomach churned. Transaction after transaction showed a pattern he couldn't ignore. Small amounts at first, then larger sums, all carefully hidden within legitimate expenses. Someone had been systematically draining funds meant for the Veterans Program. Brian's hands trembled as he pulled up more documents on his computer. The trail led straight to Thomas Wheeler, his longtime colleague and head of charitable giving. The same man who had been the most vocal opponent of increasing support for the Veterans Center. "I trusted you," Brian muttered, his jaw clenching as he stared at the evidence before him. Years of working together, countless deals closed over dinner and golf. It all felt hollow now. The betrayal cut deep, not just because of their professional relationship, but because of what the money was meant for. He thought of Jack and his quiet strength, of the other veterans who depended on the program. How many meals had been missed? How many therapy sessions canceled? How many opportunities for healing lost because of this greed? The office gradually came to life around him as employees filtered in. Brian barely noticed, lost in his mounting anger and the weight of what he had to do. This wasn't just about numbers anymore. It was about right and wrong, about standing up for people who had already sacrificed so much. At precisely 9 a.m., Thomas Wheeler strode into the office, impeccably dressed as always. Brian watched through his glass walls as Wheeler made his way to his own office, stopping to chat and laugh with co-workers, the casual confidence of a man who thought he'd never be caught. Brian gathered the printed evidence into a folder and walked to Wheeler's office. His heart pounded, but his steps were steady. He closed the door behind him, watching as Wheeler looked up with his usual practiced smile. "Brian, early bird today, aren't you? What can I do for you?" Brian placed the folder on Wheeler's desk. "You can explain this, Tom." His voice was quiet but firm. "Every transaction, every missing dollar that was supposed to go to the Veterans Program." Wheeler's smile didn't waver, but something flickered in his eyes. He barely glanced at the folder. "I'm not sure what you're talking about. All our charitable giving is properly documented and allocated." "Don't." Brian's hand came down hard on the desk. "Don't insult me by lying. I've seen every transaction. I know what you've done." Wheeler leaned back in his chair, his smile finally fading. "These are serious accusations, Brian. You should be very careful about making them without proper evidence." "The evidence is right in front of you." Brian's voice rose slightly. "Those funds were meant to help people who risked everything for this country. How could you?" "I deny any wrongdoing," Wheeler said coldly, pushing the folder away. "And I suggest you think very carefully about your next move. You wouldn't want to damage the company's reputation with unfounded allegations." Brian straightened up, looking down at the man he'd once considered a friend. His decision was made. "The truth is coming out, Tom. All of it. I won't let this stand." Brian sat at his desk, staring at the financial reports spread before him. The numbers were brutal in their clarity. the Veterans Program had less than 2 months of operating funds left. His throat felt tight as he thought about Jack and the other veterans who depended on the center. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his office. He'd been here for hours, running calculations, making calls, trying to find a solution. But every potential donor he'd contacted had declined or delayed their decision. The scandal with Wheeler had made things worse. No one wanted to be associated with a program under investigation. "What am I missing?" he muttered, rubbing his temples. The coffee on his desk had gone cold hours ago. Pictures of smiling veterans from the center's brochure seemed to watch him, their faces a reminder of what was at stake. He thought about his life just a few months ago, how simple everything had seemed when success was measured only in profit margins and stock prices. Now, sitting in his expensive office, none of that mattered. The real measure of success was in the lives they could save, the veterans they could help. The cleaning staff had already started their evening rounds, when Brian finally admitted to himself that he couldn't solve this alone. His fingers hovered over his phone for a moment before dialing Hank's number. Each ring seemed to echo his own heartbeat. "Yeah?" Hank's gruff voice answered. "Hank, it's Brian." He paused, swallowing his pride. "I need your help. The program, we're running out of time and money. I've tried everything I know, called in every favor, but it's not enough." His voice cracked slightly. "I can't do this alone." The silence on the other end stretched for what felt like forever. Then Hank spoke, his voice carrying an unexpected gentleness. "You're right. You can't do it alone. Nobody can. But maybe you're looking at this the wrong way." "What do you mean?" "You're trying to solve this like a CEO, throwing money at the problem. But sometimes leadership isn't about having all the answers yourself. It's about bringing people together, showing them what's possible." Brian leaned back in his chair, frowning. "I don't understand." "The Veterans Program isn't just about money, Brian. It's about community, about people helping people. Maybe instead of trying to be the hero who saves everything, you need to be the person who shows others how to help." The words hit Brian like a physical force. He'd been so focused on finding one big solution that he'd forgotten what had drawn him to the program in the first place. The way it brought people together. The way it gave purpose not just to the veterans but to everyone involved. I don't know how to do that," Brian admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, you do," Hank replied firmly. "You've got skills I don't have. You know how to organize, how to bring people together. Use that. Stop trying to be the savior and start being a leader." Brian looked out his window at the city lights twinkling in the darkness. For the first time in days, he felt something shift inside him. Not quite hope, but the beginning of understanding. "Will you help me?" he asked. "I'll help," Hank said. "But not by taking over. You need to step up, Brian. Show these people what they can do together. That's how we'll save the program." Brian's office came alive with a new energy as he pulled out his leather-bound contact book. The gilt-edged pages contained hundreds of names, CEOs, business owners, and philanthropists he'd met over the years. He'd always kept these connections close for business deals, but now they meant something different. His fingers flew across his keyboard as he drafted email after email. Each message was personal, carefully crafted to speak to the individual recipient's interests and values. He wasn't just asking for money. He was inviting them to be part of something meaningful. "Sarah, it's Brian Taylor." He spoke into his phone, calling an old friend who ran a successful marketing firm. "Remember that favor you owe me? I need something different this time." He explained about the Veterans Program, about Jack and the others who depended on it. Sarah's enthusiasm grew as he talked, and by the end of the call, she'd pledged not just money, but her firm's services to help promote the cause. The night wore on. Brian loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves. Coffee cups accumulated on his desk as he worked through his list. Some calls went straight to voicemail. Others connected him with skeptical executives who needed convincing. But with each conversation, Brian felt his purpose growing stronger. "Think about it, David," he urged another potential donor. "This isn't just charity. It's an investment in our community. These veterans risked everything for us. Now it's our turn to step up." He could hear the change in David's voice as understanding dawned. Between calls, Brian jotted down ideas on his whiteboard: corporate sponsorships, matching donation programs, community outreach events. The plan was taking shape, becoming something bigger than he'd initially imagined. His assistant poked her head in around midnight, concern evident on her face. "Mr. Taylor, shouldn't you be heading home?" Brian shook his head, already dialing another number. "Not yet, Linda. Too much to do." He paused, then added, "But could you order some fresh coffee? And maybe get yourself something too. I might need your help with this." Linda smiled, understanding in her eyes. "Of course, sir." As Brian worked, he thought about how different this felt from his usual late nights at the office. Those had been about profit margins and market share. This was about people. Real people with real needs. He thought about Jack's story, about the quiet strength in his eyes when he talked about his struggles. That's what made this worth fighting for. His phone buzzed, another response to his emails. A tech company CEO was offering to donate computers for a job training program. A restaurant chain wanted to provide meals for veterans attending support groups. Each positive response added another piece to the puzzle. Around 2 a.m., his phone rang again. This time, it was Hank's number lighting up the screen. Brian's heart quickened. He hadn't expected to hear from him at this hour. "It's time to make a real difference," Hank said without preamble. Brian looked at his whiteboard, covered now with plans and possibilities, at the scattered coffee cups and meeting notes, at the emails still waiting to be answered. He thought about everything that had brought him to this moment, and he knew his answer with absolute certainty. "Yes," Brian replied, his voice firm with conviction. "Whatever it takes." Brian adjusted his bow tie in front of the mirror at the Grand Plaza Hotel's executive suite. The ballroom downstairs was already filling with guests, corporate leaders, local politicians, and most importantly, veterans from the outreach program. His reflection showed a different man than the one who'd insulted Hank months ago. The polished exterior remained, but his eyes held a new purpose. "Looking sharp," Hank's gruff voice came from behind him. Brian turned to see the former Hells Angels leader wearing a well-fitted suit that somehow didn't diminish his commanding presence. "Though I still feel like a fish out of water in this monkey suit." Brian smiled, remembering how they'd convinced Hank to swap his leather jacket for formal wear. "The donors expect a certain image," he said, straightening Hank's slightly crooked tie. "But they're going to hear the real story tonight." The past week had been a whirlwind of preparations. Brian had leveraged every connection he had, transforming the hotel's grand ballroom into an elegant venue worthy of the city's elite. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, while carefully placed photographs of veterans and their families lined the walls. Each image told a story of struggle and hope. "Jack's ready with his speech," Hank said, moving to the window that overlooked the arriving guests. "Nervous as hell, but ready." Brian nodded, remembering how they'd worked with Jack to prepare his testimony. The veteran's story would be the heart of tonight's event, raw, honest, and powerful. "He'll do great. His truth is what people need to hear." They headed downstairs, where volunteers from the Veterans Program were greeting guests. Brian had insisted on involving them in every aspect of the evening. These weren't just beneficiaries of charity. They were partners in the mission. The ballroom hummed with energy, Waiters circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres, while a string quartet played softly in the corner. Brian spotted familiar faces: Sarah from the marketing firm, David with his investment group, and dozens of others who'd responded to his late-night calls for support. Linda, his assistant, approached with a tablet in hand. "The donation tracking system is live," she reported. "People can pledge directly from their phones. We've already received several substantial commitments." "Perfect," Brian said, scanning the growing crowd. He noticed some veterans looking uncomfortable in their borrowed suits, but each wore their military pins proudly. That contrast between their service and their current struggles was exactly what he wanted the donors to see. Hank clasped his shoulder. "Time to make the rounds," he said. "Remember, these fancy folks aren't just here for tax write-offs. Make them feel the mission." Brian straightened his spine, feeling the weight of the evening ahead. The Veterans Program needed more than just tonight's donations. It needed long-term commitments, sustainable support, and genuine understanding from the community. Everything had to be perfect. He glanced at his watch. In 30 minutes, the formal program would begin. Jack would share his story, followed by Hank's overview of the program's impact. Then Brian would present their vision for the future: expanded services, new facilities, and innovative support systems for veterans in need. His heart raced with a familiar pre-presentation anxiety. But this time it felt different. This wasn't about profit margins or market share. This was about Jack, about all the veterans who deserved a chance at a better life. This was about redemption, not just for the program, but for himself. Taking a deep breath, Brian stepped forward to welcome his first group of potential donors. The evening that would determine the Veterans Program's future had begun. The Grand Plaza Hotel ballroom buzzed with excitement as the evening drew to a close. Champagne glasses clinked, and the sound of genuine laughter filled the air. Brian stood near the donation tracking display, watching the numbers climb higher. The evening had gone better than he'd imagined. Jack's speech had moved many to tears, and Hank's presentation had shown the true impact of their work. Linda approached Brian with her tablet, her usual confident stride faltering slightly. "Mr. Taylor, I need to speak with you privately." Brian excused himself from a conversation with a prominent donor and followed Linda to a quiet corner. The look on her face made his stomach tighten. "The Anderson Foundation just pulled their pledge," she said quietly, showing him the screen. "All $5 million. Brian felt the air leave his lungs. The Anderson Foundation had been their largest committed donor, the cornerstone of their funding strategy. Without their contribution, the entire expansion plan would crumble. "There must be some mistake," Brian said, pulling out his phone. He dialed James Anderson's number, but it went straight to voicemail. A quick check of his emails revealed a terse message from the Foundation's board. "Due to unforeseen circumstances, we must withdraw our pledge effective immediately." The weight of responsibility pressed down on Brian's shoulders. He looked around the ballroom, seeing the hopeful faces of veterans who'd put their trust in him. Jack stood in a corner, animated as he spoke with potential donors. Volunteers moved through the crowd with quiet dignity, sharing their stories. Brian loosened his bow, tie suddenly feeling confined. The room that had felt so full of promise now seemed to close in around him. $5 million. The number echoed in his head, mocking his earlier confidence. "Should I inform Hank?" Linda asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," Brian said quickly. "Not yet. Let's not spoil the evening for everyone else." He made his way through the crowd, maintaining a practiced smile while his mind raced through possibilities. Could he make up the difference himself? No. He'd already committed most of his liquid assets to the program. Could he find another major donor at this late stage? The chances seemed slim. The cool night air hit his face as he stepped onto the hotel's terrace. The city lights twinkled below, indifferent to his predicament. Just hours ago, he'd been certain they'd succeeded. Now they were back where they started. Worse, perhaps, because they'd given people hope. Brian leaned against the stone railing, his knuckles white with tension. The veterans' faces flashed through his mind, men and women who'd served their country, who deserved better than broken promises. He thought of Jack, who'd bared his soul tonight, trusting that his vulnerability would help others. The sound of footsteps behind him broke through his thoughts. He didn't need to turn around to know it was Hank. He'd grown familiar with the man's presence over the past months. "Linda told me," Hank said simply, moving to stand beside him. Brian shook his head, unable to meet Hank's gaze. $5 million, Hank. Gone with one phone call. Everything we planned, everything we promised those people in there. "This isn't over yet," Hank said, placing a firm hand on Brian's shoulder. His voice carried the same quiet strength that had first caught Brian's attention months ago. "The real work starts now." The sun hadn't yet risen when Brian sat at his kitchen table, nursing his third cup of coffee. His laptop screen glowed in the dim light, spreadsheets and financial reports scattered across it. He'd been up all night, running numbers, making calls to different time zones, trying to find a solution to replace the Anderson Foundation's funding. Nothing worked. Every calculation led to the same dead end. Brian rubbed his tired eyes and leaned back in his chair. Through the window, he could see the first hints of dawn painting the sky. His gaze fell on a framed photo on his wall, a recent edition showing him with Jack and some other veterans at the center. They were all smiling, working together to repair the center's roof. Something clicked in his mind. That day had nothing to do with money. It was about showing up, rolling up his sleeves, and doing the work that needed to be done. "I've been looking at this all wrong," he muttered to himself. Brian pulled out his phone and started scrolling through his contacts. Not his usual list of wealthy donors and corporate executives, but the local business owners he'd met over the past few months. The hardware store owner who'd given them supplies at cost. The diner owner who occasionally provided meals for the veterans. The printing shop that had done their flyers for free. These people didn't have millions to give, but they had something just as valuable. They were part of the community. By 8 o'clock, Brian was dressed and heading to Main Street. He walked into Joe's diner, where the morning crowd was just starting to thin out. "Morning, Brian," Joe called from behind the counter. "The usual?" "Actually, Joe, I need to talk to you about something else." Brian sat at the counter, explaining the situation with the Anderson Foundation and his new idea. Joe listened intently, wiping his hands on his apron. "So instead of chasing big donors, you want to build a network of local support?" "Exactly," Brian nodded. "What if we created a community alliance? Businesses helping where they can, sharing resources, working together. The Veterans Program doesn't just need money, it needs sustainable long-term support." Joe's face broke into a wide smile. "Count me in, and you should talk to Sarah at the grocery store. She's always looking for ways to give back." By lunchtime, Brian had visited 12 local businesses. Each conversation energized him more than the last. Sarah from the grocery store offered to provide food for weekly community dinners. Mike from the auto shop volunteered to teach basic car maintenance classes. The local gym agreed to offer free memberships to veterans in the program. At the hardware store, Tom didn't just agree to help. He called his brother who owned a construction company. "We could renovate that old wing of the center," Tom suggested. "Turn it into proper training spaces." Brian's phone buzzed constantly with messages from business owners he'd spoken to, each connecting him with others who wanted to help. What had started as a desperate attempt to save the program was turning into something bigger, a true community movement. By late afternoon, he stood in front of the Veterans Center, watching as Jack helped unload boxes of donated supplies from Joe's truck. The parking lot was busier than usual, with several local business owners dropping by to offer their support. "This feels different," Jack said, walking over to Brian. "These people, they're not just writing checks, they're investing themselves." Brian nodded, feeling a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. The loss of the Anderson Foundation still stung, but something more valuable was taking root. Hope was growing, not from the top down, but from the ground up. The community center buzzed with activity as Brian directed volunteers hanging banners and setting up tables. This wasn't like the previous fundraiser with its crystal champagne flutes and designer centerpieces. Instead, local businesses had donated everything from folding chairs to home-baked cookies. "The sound system's all set up," called Mike from the auto shop, giving Brian a thumbs up. He had brought his teenage son's band equipment to provide music for the evening. Sarah from the grocery store bustled past with a team of volunteers, carrying trays of sandwiches and fruit platters. "We've got enough food to feed an army," she said with a wink. "Which is exactly what we need." Brian smiled, checking his watch. In just 2 hours, the doors would open for what they were calling a night of community heroes. His phone buzzed, another local business pledging support. This time it was the bowling alley offering free weekly sessions for veterans. Jack appeared at his side, looking around at the transformed space. "This is something else, Brian. Never thought I'd see the day when the whole town came together like this." "Neither did I," Brian admitted, straightening a tablecloth. "But it turns out people just needed to be asked, to feel like they were truly part of something." The doors opened at 6, and people started streaming in. Unlike the previous event's crowd of wealthy donors in expensive suits, this gathering looked like a true slice of small-town America. Families with children, elderly couples, teenagers, business owners, and veterans, all mingling together. Tom from the hardware store had set up a display showing plans for the center's renovation. "We've got contractors willing to donate their weekends," he explained to interested attendees. "Just need materials and permits." The local newspaper editor moved through the crowd, taking photos and gathering stories. "This is front-page material," she told Brian. "The whole county needs to see what's happening here." Brian took the stage at 8 o'clock, looking out over the packed room. His prepared speech sat in his pocket, untouched. Instead, he spoke from his heart. "A few months ago, I thought success meant having the biggest bank account or the most impressive title," he began. "But thanks to this community, thanks to all of you, I've learned what real success looks like. It looks like this room right now." The donation total kept climbing throughout the evening. Local businesses matched individual contributions. Children emptied their piggy banks. Veterans shared their stories, moving people to give what they could. A cheer went up when they surpassed their goal, then another when they doubled it. The energy in the room was electric, filled with the joy of people united for a common cause. Brian stood to the side, watching as Hank chatted with a group of elderly veterans, while Jack showed a young family around the center. Local shop owners discussed plans for ongoing support with program coordinators. What had started as a desperate attempt to save one program had transformed into something much more powerful, a community rediscovering its heart. The donations weren't just about money anymore. They were promises of time, skills, and resources. They were commitments to be part of, something larger than themselves. As Brian looked around at the smiling faces and heard the buzz of excited conversation, he felt a deep sense of pride. not in himself, but in what people could achieve when they came together. This was what true success felt like. As the crowd began to thin and volunteers started cleaning up, Hank found Brian standing near the center's entrance. The evening light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. Hank's weathered face broke into a genuine smile, not the intimidating expression Brian had first encountered months ago, but one of warmth and pride. "You've done something remarkable here," Hank said, his deep voice carrying the weight of experience. He gestured to the donation board, where the final total far exceeded their expectations. "But it's not about the money. It's about who you've become." Brian felt his throat tighten with emotion. He looked down at his clothes, a simple button-down shirt and slacks, a far cry from his usual tailored suits. His expensive watch had been replaced by a practical sports model after too many paint-splattered renovation sessions. "I hardly recognize myself sometimes," Brian admitted, running a hand through his hair. "That man who bumped into you on the street, he feels like a stranger now." Hank nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's because he is. The man standing here now understands what really matters." He paused, watching as Jack helped an elderly veteran navigate through the scattered chairs. "You've learned what I learned years ago. That true strength isn't about power or money. It's about serving others." Brian thought back to his first days at the center, how uncomfortable he'd felt among the veterans and volunteers. Now, these people were like family. He knew their stories, their struggles, their triumphs. He'd sat with them during tough moments and celebrated their victories. "I was so focused on climbing the corporate ladder," Brian said, shaking his head. "I thought that's what would make me happy. But I found more satisfaction here, helping others, than I ever did in the boardroom." A young volunteer approached them, carrying a stack of flyers for next week's support group meeting. Brian automatically reached out to help, the gesture now natural and unthinking. Hank noticed this small action and smiled. "That's exactly what I mean," Hank said after the volunteer left. "These little moments of kindness, they've become part of who you are. Not because someone's watching, but because that's just who you are now." They walked together through the center, past the newly painted walls and refurbished furniture. Every corner held a memory for Brian now. Late nights planning fundraisers, weekend renovation projects, quiet conversations with veterans who just needed someone to listen. "Thank you," Brian said suddenly, stopping in his tracks. "For showing me a better way. For not giving up on me even when I probably deserved it." Hank placed a strong hand on Brian's shoulder. "You did the hard work. You chose to change. That takes more courage than most people realize." Brian glanced around the room, taking in the scene before him. In one corner, a group of veterans gathered around a coffee pot, sharing stories and laughter. Near the window, volunteers organized supplies for tomorrow's job training workshop. The walls, once bare and institutional, now displayed artwork created by program participants. Each element represented a piece of the community they'd built together, a community that had transformed Brian as much as he'd helped transform the center. Standing there, watching people move about their tasks with purpose and care, Brian felt something settle deep in his soul. The restless ambition that had driven him for so long was replaced by something quieter, more meaningful. For the first time in his life, he felt truly at peace. Brian sat in his corner office, staring at the email on his screen. The board had just offered him the position of global CEO, a role he'd dreamed about for decades. The compensation package made his already generous salary look modest in comparison. 5 years ago, this would have been everything he'd ever wanted. Now, it felt hollow. He glanced at the framed photo on his desk, a group shot from the Veterans Center's latest graduation ceremony. The smiling faces of program participants who'd successfully completed their job training looked back at him. In the background, he could see Hank's proud expression and Jack's gentle smile. His secretary knocked on the door, interrupting his thoughts. "The board is waiting for your response, Mr. Taylor. They'd like to make the announcement by end of day." Brian nodded, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Thank you, Sarah. I'll have my answer shortly." After she left, he pulled out his phone and looked at the text message he'd received from Jack earlier that morning. "We've got 3 new veterans joining the program today. Could use your help showing them around." The contrast between these two worlds, the corporate sphere he'd inhabited for so long, and the meaningful work at the Veterans Center, had never felt starker. The corner office, with its elegant furnishings and city views, suddenly felt suffocating. Brian stood up and walked to the window, watching the bustling street below. He thought about all the board meetings, the quarterly reports, the endless chase for higher profits. Then he remembered yesterday at the center, helping a veteran fix a broken chair while sharing stories about life. The simple act had brought him more joy than any corporate victory ever had. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Hank. "Whatever you decide, make sure it's what your heart tells you is right." Brian smiled, realizing Hank somehow knew about his dilemma. The old Brian would have scoffed at such sentiment, but now he understood the wisdom in those words. He returned to his desk and began typing his response to the board. His fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard as he declined their offer, explaining his decision to pursue full-time charitable work. With each word, he felt lighter, more certain of his choice. After hitting send, Brian stood and began packing his personal items into a small box. He picked up his awards and accolades, carefully wrapped in newspaper, but found they held little meaning now. The only items he truly wanted to keep were the photos from the Veterans Center and a hand-drawn thank you card from one of the program participants. His colleagues gathered around as he made his way through the office. Some looked confused, others disappointed, but a few seemed to understand. His assistant hugged him, whispering, "You seem happier these days. I think you're making the right choice." The elevator ride down felt different than usual. Instead of checking emails or reviewing documents, Brian simply watched the floor numbers decrease, each ding bringing him closer to his new life. Walking through the lobby for the last time as an employee, Brian loosened his tie and unbuttoned his collar. The security guard, who'd seen him enter this building thousands of times over the years, gave him a knowing nod. "Going to help those veterans full-time now, Mr. Taylor?" "Yes, George. That's exactly what I'm doing." "Good for you, sir. Good for you." Outside, Brian hailed a cab and gave the driver the address of the Veterans Center. As the taxi pulled away from the corporate tower, he didn't look back. His heart was already focused on what lay ahead. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Veterans Center as Brian helped Jack organize supplies for the day's activities. Hank walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and handed one to Brian. "Still getting used to seeing you in jeans and a t-shirt," Hank chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "But I have to admit, it suits you better than those $1,000 suits." Brian accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. "Amazing how comfortable actual comfortable clothes are," he said, earning a laugh from both men. They walked together through the center's main hall, where veterans were already gathering for the morning's support group. The walls, once bare and institutional, now displayed artwork created by program participants and photos from various community events. "Remember when you first walked in here?" Hank asked, gesturing to the entrance. "Looking like you'd rather be anywhere else?" Brian shook his head, smiling at the memory. "I was such an idiot. Thought I had everything figured out." They paused to help an elderly veteran with his walker, each taking an arm to steady him as he made his way to his seat. The man patted their hands in thanks, his weathered face brightening with a smile. "You know what's funny?" Brian said as they moved to the back of the room. "I used to measure success by the number of zeros in my bank account. Now I measure it by the number of smiles we see in here every day." Hank nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's why we make such a good team. You brought your business sense here, helped us organize better, reach more veterans. But you also learned what really matters." They watched as more veterans filtered in, greeting each other with warm handshakes and hugs. Some were new faces, still carrying the weight of their struggles, while others were program veterans themselves, returning to help guide those just starting their journey. "See that guy over there?" Hank pointed to a young man helping set up chairs. "When he first came in, he wouldn't look anyone in the eye. Now he's one of our best peer counselors." Brian remembered his own transformation. "It's amazing what can happen when people are given a chance and shown some kindness." Working together, they had expanded the center's services, combining Hank's street-smart approach with Brian's organizational skills. Where Hank knew how to reach people on a personal level, Brian knew how to structure programs and secure sustainable funding. Their different backgrounds and experiences had created something neither could have achieved alone. "You know what's really funny?" Hank said, leaning against the wall. "That day you bumped into me on the street. I was actually thinking about how to improve our outreach program. Never thought the answer would literally run into me." Brian laughed softly. The universe has a strange sense of humor. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the room fill with people whose lives they'd touched. The morning light filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow over the scene. In that moment, both men felt the profound impact of their unlikely friendship, a partnership that had not only transformed countless lives, but had also changed them both for the better. "Coffee's getting cold," Hank said, raising his cup. "Small price to pay for good company," Brian replied, lifting his own in response. Brian stood in his former corner office, 40 stories above the bustling city streets. The space felt different now, smaller, less important somehow. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the now empty desk, where he'd spent countless hours chasing profits and promotions. He ran his hand along the polished mahogany surface, remembering the late nights and early mornings. The desk calendar still showed last month's appointments, board meetings, investor calls, strategic planning sessions. All of it had seemed so crucial then. "Quite a view, isn't it?" came a voice from the doorway. Sarah, his former assistant, stood there with a small box of his remaining personal items. "It is," Brian agreed, accepting the box. "Though these days, I prefer the view from the Veterans Center. You can actually see people's lives changing there." Inside the box, he found the various trappings of his corporate life. Crystal paperweight from a successful merger, his CEO of the Year award, family photos in expensive frames. Each item told a story of who he used to be. "The board still hopes you'll reconsider," Sarah said, straightening a pile of papers on the desk out of habit. "They've increased their offer twice now." Brian shook his head, picking up the paperweight and watching it catch the morning light. "A year ago, that would have meant everything to me. Funny how things change." He thought about Jack, the veteran who'd shared his story of PTSD and recovery, about the young soldiers just returning home, looking for purpose and understanding, about Hank, whose gruff exterior had hidden such wisdom and compassion. Walking to the window, Brian looked down at the street where he'd first encountered Hank. From up here, people looked like tiny dots moving through their daily routines. He'd once felt so superior viewing the world from this height, but now he understood. Real life happened down there, not up here in these glass towers. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a framed photo, one taken just last week at the Veterans Center. In it, he stood with Hank and a group of veterans, all smiling after completing a successful fundraising event. No expensive suits, no forced corporate smiles, just genuine joy and connection. "You seem different," Sarah observed, watching him study the photo. "Happier." "I am," Brian replied, carefully placing the photo in the box. "For the first time in my life, I'm doing something that matters beyond quarterly reports and stock prices." He walked around the office one last time, remembering the man who had once inhabited this space. The arrogant CEO who measured worth in dollars and status. That version of himself felt like a stranger now. Opening a drawer, he found his old business cards. Brian Taylor, Chief Executive Officer, printed in bold letters on heavy cardstock. He slipped one into his wallet, not as a reminder of what he'd lost, but of how far he'd come. "The cleaning crew will be here tomorrow to clear everything out," Sarah said, her voice professional but tinged with sadness. Brian nodded, picking up the box. The weight of his past corporate life felt light compared to the meaningful work awaiting him at the Veterans Center. He took one final look around the office, remembering countless meetings and decisions made within these walls. "You know," he said, turning to Sarah, "I used to think this office represented success. Now I understand it was just a really expensive cage." The autumn breeze carried the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings as Brian and Hank stood side by side on the front steps of the renovated Veterans Center. The building, once worn and struggling, now gleamed with renewed purpose. A large banner declaring "Grand Reopening" fluttered above the entrance, its bright colors matching the excitement in the air. Veterans, volunteers, and community members milled about the grounds, their chatter and laughter creating a warm atmosphere. Some sat at newly installed picnic tables, while others explored the expanded facilities. Through the windows, Brian could see the updated computer lab, where veterans now learned new skills, and the renovated counseling rooms where healing conversations took place daily. "Remember when we first started this?" Brian asked, watching as Jack, their friend and resident veteran, showed a group of newcomers around the garden he'd helped plant. "I never thought we'd get here." Hank's weathered face creased with a knowing look. "You were different then," he said, adjusting his leather jacket. "All polish and corporate shine, no substance." Brian chuckled, remembering his designer suits and the way he'd once looked down on everyone around him. Now, dressed in casual clothes and work boots, he felt more authentic than he ever had in his expensive office. Inside, the center hummed with activity. The kitchen, newly equipped through their fundraising efforts, served hot meals to veterans in need. The dining area, once cramped and dreary, now opened onto a peaceful courtyard where therapeutic programs took place. They walked through the building, stopping occasionally to greet familiar faces. In the recreation room, a group of veterans played cards, their easy laughter a testament to the healing power of community. The walls, once bare, now displayed artwork created by the veterans themselves, each piece telling a story of recovery and hope. "You know what gets me?" Hank said, pausing by a window overlooking the vegetable garden. "How something so good came from you being such a jerk that day." Brian smiled, remembering their first encounter. "I deserved worse than what you gave me." "Maybe," Hank agreed with a slight smirk. "But look what came of it." They continued their tour, checking on the new dormitory wing where veterans could stay while getting back on their feet. The rooms were simple but dignified, offering sanctuary to those who needed it most. Brian noticed how Hank nodded approvingly at every detail. The sturdy furniture, the clean linens, the personal touches that made each space feel like home. As the day wound down, they found themselves back outside, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The crowd had thinned, leaving behind a peaceful quiet. A few veterans remained, gathered around one of the fire pits, sharing stories and companionship. The light caught the chrome of Hank's motorcycle parked nearby, the same bike that had been there the day Brian had made his fateful mistake. Now it represented not intimidation, but transformation, a symbol of how far they'd both come. Brian looked at his friend, this unlikely mentor who'd helped him find his true purpose, the former corporate executive and the ex-Hell's Angel, now partners in something greater than themselves. The Veterans Center stood as testament to what could happen when people put aside their differences and worked toward something meaningful. "I think we did it," Brian said simply, his voice carrying the weight of their shared journey. Hank nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees surrounding the Veterans Center, carrying with it the warmth of accomplishment and new beginnings. Brian stood on the freshly painted porch, his hands resting on the smooth wooden railing that he and several veterans had installed just last week. Beside him, Hank's imposing figure cast a long shadow in the late afternoon light. The center buzzed with activity as volunteers and veterans moved about, their voices mixing with the sound of clinking coffee cups and gentle laughter. Through the large windows, Brian could see Jack leading a group therapy session in one of the new meeting rooms, his weathered face animated as he shared his experiences with newcomers. "Look at all this," Brian said softly, gesturing to the renovated building. The fresh paint gleamed in the sunlight, and new signs directed visitors to various services, counseling rooms, job training facilities, and the expanded dormitory wing. "It's hard to believe what this place used to be." Hank crossed his arms, his leather jacket creaking with the movement. "Sometimes the best things come from rough beginnings," he replied, his voice carrying the gruff warmth that Brian had come to know well. Inside, the kitchen staff prepared dinner for the residents, the aroma of home-cooked meals wafting through the open windows. The dining area, once cramped and dated, now sparkled with new equipment and comfortable seating. Veterans gathered around tables, sharing stories and supporting one another in their recovery journeys. Brian watched as a young veteran tentatively approached the front desk, his shoulders tense with uncertainty. The volunteer greeted him with a warm smile, and within moments, the young man's posture relaxed. These small transformations happened daily now, each one a reminder of why they'd fought so hard to keep the center open. "Remember when we couldn't even afford to fix the leaky roof?" Brian asked, shaking his head at the memory. "Now look at us. Full programs, trained staff, proper facilities." Hank nodded, his eyes scanning the property. The new garden beds bloomed with late summer flowers, tended by veterans who found peace in nurturing growing things. The parking lot, once cracked and faded, now had clear markings and designated spaces for disabled visitors. A group of veterans gathered around one of the outdoor seating areas, their easy camaraderie evident in their relaxed postures and occasional bursts of laughter. Some wore their military caps proudly, while others dressed in civilian clothes, but all shared the look of people who had found a safe harbor. The renovation had transformed more than just the building. Brian could see it in the faces of the staff and volunteers, in the way the veterans carried themselves with renewed dignity. The Maicha Center had become more than a place for services. It was a community, a home for those who needed one most. The sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the grounds. The golden light caught the new sign at the entrance, its letters clear and proud. Veterans Outreach Center, where hope finds home. Brian remembered the day they'd installed it, how Hank had insisted on doing the work himself, despite offers from professional contractors. As the day wound down, Brian and Hank stood in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues. The gentle murmur of conversations and the distant sound of dishes being cleared from dinner created a peaceful backdrop to their moment of reflection. Brian turned to his friend, the man who had changed his life with a chance encounter and an unspoken challenge. The last rays of sunlight caught the silver in Hank's beard and the quiet pride in his eyes. "I think we did it," Brian said simply. Hank nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you're watching from. Have a wonderful day."